Hey, good morning, everyone. I guess it's still morning. We've mostly not had lunch yet. Delegates, staff, and guests, I'm delighted to open the STI Pi seminar organized by the Productivity, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship Division, Pi, in the Science, Technology, and Innovation Directorate here at the OECD. My name is Andrew Green. I'm an economist leading the Productivity, Firm Growth, and Employment Unit in Pi, and I also lead the LIFT network that we have recently launched. LIFT is a new initiative to leverage firm-level transaction data for policy analysis in OECD member countries. And as you'll see today in this seminar, this is the seminar, and David is what he's going to talk about today will be extremely relevant for LIFT and the initiatives here in this division going forward. So I'm going to chair the seminar today, and we're pleased to have David Gelvez as our speaker. He will focus on the topic of international supply chains and domestic production networks, which, as you can imagine, is quite topical at the moment. The talk is entitled An Empirical Study of the Diffusion of Foreign Shocks in Production Networks. David is an economist, data scientist, and technologist who is currently a research fellow at Fedesarrollo, a think tank in Bogota, Colombia. David, you'll correct me on that pronunciation. Dedicated to economic and social development through studies, publications, and debates in various areas of public policy. David leads and contributes to various research projects, policy design and policy analysis on data and AI, digital economy, and globalization. According to his LinkedIn profile, he's also a lover of chocolate and a proud Colombian. David holds a PhD in economics from Yale University. Today, David will be discussing Venezuelan trade policy shocks in 2008 and 2009 and how it affected the Colombian economy, in particular, the domestic Colombian production network using firm-to-firm transaction data. Shows that firms that are dependent on Venezuelan firms oftentimes shut down, with the impacts varying by shock type and trade link, and these shocks were substantial, accounting for over 1% of Colombian GDP. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone of a few housekeeping rules. So this event will be conducted in hybrid format. If you are in the room, please just raise your hand and click on the microphone if you want to ask a question. For virtual participants, please ask the questions in the Q&A feature in Zoom application. And if you want to speak, you can also raise your hand and the technical team will assist you with your microphone. Now, before we hand it over to David, we have a very special guest here today to give some opening remarks. We are honored to invite the Ambassador Luis Fernando Medina Serra to deliver some opening remarks. Ambassador Medina is an economist and philosopher of international reputation. He holds a PhD in economics from Stanford University, a Master of Arts and bachelor's degrees in economics from the Universidad de los Andes, and a bachelor's in philosophy from the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. Ambassador Medina is the Colombian ambassador to the OECD since October 2022. Ambassador, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks for that very kind introduction. It's a delight for me to be here opening this session, because I've been, ever since I came in contact with the work of this committee, I became a booster. I've been trying to, I think it's a wonderful part of this organization, of this increasingly complex and sprawling organization. I think that the OECD has probably been pioneering in this regard. I think it was probably one of the first international organizations that trained its laser into the questions of firm-to-firm interactions across all sectors. But I mean, if I recall correctly, probably it was there before many other organizations, and it really goes to its credit, because I think one of the things that has become increasingly clear is that the challenges of productivity can only be addressed at that micro level. Of course, in an era of value chains, of so complex economic interactions, then you cannot have productivity policies that are just designed in one board, okay, and expect them to work everywhere. And so you really have to have very detailed knowledge about what works and again, the interactions across firms, because I think that is one of the major changes in international trade. So I think that the work of this committee follows on those footsteps of the organization, and I think it's very good to see it continuing. And of course, I'm very pleased that now analytical work and empirical work about Colombia's economy is contributing to the discussion. So, I mean, you didn't come to listen to me. I'm just a boring ambassador here. You came to listen to David. So I guess without further ado, I will turn it over to David. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. With that, David, the floor is yours, and you have more than 45 minutes, let's say.
Well, thanks everyone listening and online people. Thank you for coming. Señor Embajador, muchas gracias por estar aquí. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for being here. Andrew, thank you for being such a gracious host, and to all your team, to Gilles, merci beaucoup. This work is about not working. Good. A very classical question, or a classical question in economics, which is, how do shocks propagate throughout production network? This is a question that dates back to Leontiev, and my goal is to give it a more localized flavor, if I may, working with novel trade policy shocks coming from Venezuela, Colombia's second largest trading partner and its most important trading partner for non-traditional manufacturing exports at the time, with three particular questions that are relevant to understand the broader one of the diffusion of shocks in production networks. The first one is, what are the direct, that's easy, but the indirect effects on the firm's extensive margin, translation, whether firms exit in response to the shock by being exposed to them indirectly via buyer-supplier linkages. Second, what are the effects of liquidity shocks and demand shocks? And this is about heterogeneity in terms of whether there are differences in how firms react according to what type of shocks they experience. And third, what are the effects of liquidity shock according to firm types? So this is a question of heterogeneity, not about the type of shock, but about the type of firm, right? And here is a summary of the findings. Hopefully we'll get through the whole presentation and I'll get back to the summary of findings, but just in case we don't. So this paper, or this body of work, brings new data, which is the Colombian tax administrative records data, which we bring to the table. Second, and very important given our discussion this morning, we bring also a new set of computational tools to be able to tackle the scale of the data we work with. And third, the new policy shocks to codify the indirect exposure to multiple shocks as I discussed. And the three key results here from an academic standpoint are the following. First, rather obvious in theory, but perhaps not in practice, and is that heterogeneity in exposure matters. And this is very important because most of the tax administrative records correspond to binary networks in which we have data on whether a given supplier buys from or sells to a given customer. But understanding the intensity of this relationship in terms of the share of sales of purchases and extending that notion throughout the network is key to really understand what is the potential impact of a shock throughout a supply chain. And just to give you a sense of the numbers, a firm in the 90th percentile of exposure has effects about 5 times compared to the median exposure. And if we go to the 99th percentile, that impact goes to 17th times the effect on the median firm. The second point that is very important, and at the time the theory gave us some guidance, but it wasn't that clear, and is that demand shocks are relevant and in some cases larger. The effects of demand shock are relevant and in some cases larger than the effects of liquidity shocks. And there is something very important to guide the theory, and is that demand shocks actually have downstream effects. Usually from a theoretical standpoint, in a Cobb-Douglas setup, usually demand shocks only have upstream effects. But the data shows that actually demand shocks can have downstream effects. That is something that is relevant and also guides the theory. So you have an idea, an increase of 1 standard deviation in exposure would cause about 1% decrease in total sales in a period of 2 months. So this is actually about 10% of the standard deviation of the change in total sales at the time. So it's actually economically relevant. And the third key result here is that different types of exporters respond differently to shocks according to the type of competitive advantage or competitive edge that they have. And in particular, direct exporters vis-a-vis indirect trading companies that serve indirect exporters provide liquidity protection to their suppliers. So if I may sum it up in a single sentence, this is a paper showing that heterogeneity matters. It matters in exposure, it matters in the type of shock you experience, and it matters in the type of firm that you are. And the last bit of the summary is that this actually mattered for the Colombian economy. It was very, very important, and it's still very important. The first point is that Colombian firms went to the domestic market when the shock happened. So in line with the literature, this is not about venting out, as it happened in the crisis in Spain, but about venting in, going to your domestic suppliers and buyers. And the other important matter is that this is relevant. This was a sequence of shocks. So perhaps when you see the national accounts, you wouldn't find this very large shock that you would expect to see by losing your second largest trading partner. But when you add up the effects of the sequence of shocks that I will explain to you in a second, this amounts for approximately 2.5 percentage points of GDP throughout 2-3 years, which is a macroeconomically relevant quantity. If this were an entirely academic setup, I would basically discuss, the host of contributions I would do in the literature. But given that we are in the OECD, I wanted to put my bit or my grain of salt to policy. And in particular, leveraging on Andrew's and his group's recent work about an agenda for evidence-based industrial policy, leveraging VAT data. What I would like to point out from the introduction is that perhaps this framework that they propose focused on data as their main enabler and productivity, spillovers, and resilience as the key opportunities might be enhanced or complemented by considering two additional enablers. The first enabler is to find the way in which the language of network science and the toolbox of network science can connect with economically relevant questions that Andrea and I were discussing this morning, and also to solving the computational conundrum of dealing with the data of this scale. Gladly, James Williams and I, James should be connected from New Zealand, we managed to build an entire C++ library to be able to solve this computational conundrum, and is available on GitHub for all of you to use. And in terms of opportunities that we were just discussing with the ambassador prior starting the seminar, in addition to the three very interesting and policy relevant matters that the OECD has proposed in its document, there is a fourth and very important matter that I discovered actually by working and in the Colombian tax agency while I wrote this piece of work, and is how the study at scale of VAT transactional data and ergo production networks can help to bring key insights to the tax agencies around the world, and in particular the Colombian tax agency, to close the tax gap, which is something of policy relevance not only for Colombia, but also for OECD members around the world. So with that, here is my agenda for today. The first part is to discuss or briefly discuss the empirical strategy that I used to produce this work. Second, I'll be discussing in passing, the results for the indirect effects, meaning the market level questions about the extensive margin that I mentioned in the beginning. The second part, I will be discussing the difference in diffusion patterns of demand and trade credit shocks. And in third place, I'll be discussing the difference in how firms react to a liquidity shock according to the type of firms they are. I'll be wrapping up with the aggregate effects to show you basically, a back of the envelope calculations, why these add about 2%, 2.5% of GDP. And finally, I would like to discuss some future reasons and some lessons that I would like to bring to the table for evidence-based industrial policy. With that, let's go to the empirical strategy. So the empirical strategy has four components. The first is to actually get the data straight, non-trivial, as the OECD is working on. The second is to map and codify the trade policy shocks. That also takes it was an important piece of work, as we need to map and understand Venezuelan trade policy in detail to understand how a given product was actually granted access or not to US dollars at the time. The third part is to complete this or to get this together in the definition of treated and controlled units within the network. And finally, to propose a baseline econometric specification that I promise will have the only equation in this presentation. So let's get to the firm level data. I have a very very small summary of an entire paper we actually wrote with my colleague James about how we actually built from Colombian tax administrative records a panel of networks. And I guess this is going to be useful for the OECD as it engages in a cross-country effort of the same nature. So basically, we used 3 key administrative records: the unique taxation registry, which is a user characterization when it applies and maintains the tax identification number. In France, I would say that this comes from any of the forms you had to fill in order to get a SIREN. Excuse me for my pronunciation. Second is the VAT returns, in which we have information on sales and purchases. And third, the third-party relationship report, that is a key input to map firm-to-firm transactions. DAS2 is what I was able to gather on the web. The records are processed and merged to build a single network per year. This is non-trivial. There is a host of data and heterogeneous types of relationships that we were able to select, clean, and assemble into a single production network for a given year. This, of course, is very interesting, but has a limitation of what the Colombian tax agency is able to observe. So you have an idea, given the informality problem in Colombia, this is about 50% of the Colombian value add in a given year. Take or leave. Throughout this work, given that the shocks occurred in 2008 and 2009, I'll be using the 2007 production network, in which I will select the links that are relevant in this context, which I would define as 1% for the buyer or the seller. That gives me a network of about 130,000 firms and 1.3 million relationships that span around 32% of GDP. And as I mentioned before, and this is available on GitHub, we built computational tools to process and parse the large-scale network, weighted networks that we built to do this. Just for you to see, this is the distribution, the counter-cumulative distribution of the binary degree, the binary in degree, or the sum of suppliers, or the count of the number of suppliers. And this is compared with the distribution of the normalized in degree of the sum of the shares of the suppliers' sales that are going through this network. And my main point here is that by building this data set and taking heterogeneity seriously in terms of the weights in the network is important. The correlation between these two things is positive, and actually interesting 0.32 candle correlation, but it is non-trivial. Actually, I have a table here that I'll show you with if I have time, which is firms in the largest percentiles of, let's say, the number of suppliers, not necessarily have the largest concentration in terms of weights, and vice versa. So taking into account seriously what are, how outputs are flowing through the network in terms of the weights matters. Mapping and codifying trade policy shocks. So the second component is about understanding a little bit of, what happened with Venezuela. And this, the origin of this stems from how Venezuela went from a floating exchange regime to a managed exchange regime, and how it used different trade policies to, manage their economy. And there are 3 particular things or shocks that are relevant in this context. The first is a car quota. Most of Colombian car exports went to Venezuela. A quota started in January 2008. The second is a change in access to US dollars. There is a history of this that I'll just briefly discuss in a second, but the Venezuelan government at the time managed at the 10-digit level in terms of products to what type of product were you able to get US dollars at an official exchange rate and to which ones you didn't. So this was a very important matter for Venezuelan importers about how cheap or how expensive products could be at the time. The trade embargo that was declared out of political reasons in July 2009. Most of the literature on the Colombia-Venezuela relationship is focused on the 2009 shock, but the history of understanding how actually Venezuelan importers managed to get US dollars and in consequence pay Colombian exporters for their export is crucial. That's why I discuss liquidity shocks and demand shocks. So you have an idea of how this looks like, and the work I did. I tracked the history of how these regulations at the product level occur from 2003 until 2009. This is an example of one of those lists. So in the end, there was a multiple tier system in which some products were given priority access. It was a fast track to get US dollars at the official exchange rate. There was a conditional tier in which you were able to get dollars at the official exchange rate, but it took time for you to get them. And whatever products were not in that list, they had to go to the market to get the dollars at the more expensive exchange rate. This was important because depending on the product you imported, then your product became more expensive or not, at the with one piece of paper. And also the longer it took the Venezuelan authority to grant you the dollars, the longer it took the Venezuelan importers to pay the Colombian exporters. And given the timing of payments in international trade operations, this is key for the liquidity of Colombian firms. So at some point, Venezuelan importers started paying from 90 days to 120 days to 150 days, and at some point they defaulted. There is a multiplicity of shocks, but I will focus on three of them. The car quota, which is clearly a demand shock. That's why I spoke at the beginning about demand shocks. There is a liquidity shock, which pertains payment delays. With different this list, I was able to build 5 sets of products. One of them exposed to a liquidity shock, one of them exposed to a pure demand shock. And then there are 2 remaining product groups that I will not use, that they experience both liquidity and demand shocks. I won't use them because I want to separate clearly what liquidity and what demand shocks were occurred. So you have an idea. Separating the product groups gives you an idea of the timing. So going back to my question of my issue of heterogeneity, understanding what products experience what type of shock and when will give you an idea of when do you have to look for the shocks. So for instance, in the car quota, you will see that exports start collapsing in 2008, and they experience an additional dip in 2009. And then for the products that were in the conditional list in 2008, that means that they experience a liquidity shock since March 2008. They start to collapse in 2008 and they plummet as the liquidity stress becomes harder. Perhaps I forgot to mention this, but the liquidity crisis in Venezuela originates in the Great Trade Collapse because Venezuelan exporting revenues plummeted as commodity revenues plummeted as oil prices dropped. As this was a managed trade regime and most of Venezuelan US dollars came from US export revenues, this was the origin of the liquidity crisis. Now, we have a production network. We have 3 clearly defined shocks. I went through them very quickly, but I will happy to get into the details. Now the question is, how do we formulate this so we can actually do some econometrics in this? And this is very, this will make it clearer, and is that there are some directly exposed firms, which are the exporters, the dark blue dots in the graph. And there would be some indirectly exposed firms, the buyers and the suppliers. That exposure can be, upstream or downstream. The upstream exposure is they concern the blue dots, and the downstream exposure, which are the buyers in this network, concern the orange dots. Now, these circles are actually numbered by the distance to the exporters in terms of the number of steps. So the direct suppliers would be distance 1, then the suppliers of the suppliers would be at distance 2, so on and so forth. So the trick here is that I would define directly exposed firms as those firms selling to Venezuela. 5% or more of their sales going to Venezuela would make a firm directly exposed. And then by using the weights in the network, I define indirect exposure according to the proportion, to an approximation of the proportion of sales that it was going to the exporters to Venezuela, or a proportion of the purchases that was made to those firms exported to Venezuela. This is where computation is key. Because imagine this is a network of 130,000 million relationships. So we managed to map all supply chains coming in and out of exporters and calculating the weights coming in and out of exporters to get a metric of indirect exposure. Why there are 3 or 4 gray dots in this graph? Because you have to define a control group, right? So I define the treated firms as those directly or indirectly exposed, the dark blue, the blue, and the orange ones. And the indirect and the treatment group would be those firms that are weakly exposed at distance 3, or those that are at distance 4 or more. This basically makes sense as exposure decays over time. Over the number of links that separate exporters from the rest of firms in the economy. Now, here is a snapshot of the network. It is very important to highlight something that was crucial for this work, and is that exporters tend to cluster among them. So it is not only important to define a treatment and control setup in terms of like their distance to those directly exposed, meaning the exporters to Venezuela, but also to take into account how exporters relate among themselves and how the firms that serve exporters, either as suppliers or as buyers, related among themselves. Just to give you an example, one firm that exported to Venezuela could also be a supplier to one of the firms that exported to Venezuela. And that replicates all along the chain. So this is something that it cannot be, it doesn't work if you use a research design that only considers this vertical distance to and from direct exporters. This depends also on the relationships across firms. And finally, given all these 3 components, we get to the baseline econometric specification. So bear with me. Direct effects are the first part. This doesn't have a winter. The direct effects are basically the marginal effect of how much, or the proportion of sales to Venezuela, which would be the first part of the first bit of the equation, which is the beta. The second term would be the upstream effects, and is how much were you actually selling to those firms that were exporting to Venezuela. That would be the second term. And then the third term would be how much were you buying from those firms that sold to Venezuela. That would be the third term. So you would ask, why would you bother with the rest of the terms in this equation? And if you claimed this regression, if you would claim that this regression would capture causal effects, you would need to control for all this entanglement I just discussed. You will need to control for the fact that Venezuelan exporters and their supply chains are buying and selling to exporters that sell to other destinations, and therefore were exposed also to the Great Trade Collapse. And that happens directly, indirectly, via upstream or downstream effects. And also, as a matter of controls, I include time fix effects and firm fix effects. Good. I have some details about how I basically run these equations in terms of like what's a dependent variable, which is basically the growth rate, but to be able to take into account entry and exit. That's why I have a normalized growth rate throughout the paper. I do this every 2 months, or I calculate this, I estimate this regression at a 2-month period, given the frequency of that filing at the time. And my idea is to show different results that take this regression capture, or that showed how the effects capture this regression with a larger degree of granularity over time. Good. So let's get to results. Indirect effects test a very simple hypothesis. And my idea is to test it in the simplest possible setup, which is I show you and hopefully I convince you that there are multiple shocks happening at multiple or different times throughout the period of analysis. But I decided to test this, not collapsing all this variation into just being exposed to the Venezuelan market or not over time. Why would I do this? Because if I were to observe this effect in the simplest regression possible, most likely the effect would be present in the more complex and granular specification, which is the case. And the simplest hypothesis is that indirectly exposed firms exit in response to a negative shock. That should not be surprising to anyone. But the important bit from an empirical standpoint to actually fit the theory is that the stronger or the larger the exposure, the stronger the response should be, both in the intensive, how much you sell or not, and the extensive margin, whether you exit or not. Right? It's very simple hypothesis. And the answer is yes. Now, this shows the effects on the total sales growth. The columns are the order, or how many steps away are you from the direct exporters, first order, second order, third order. And the rows represent or capture the results on the type of the data that I use. And I use 2 panels to capture the entry or exit in this context. In the restricted sample, you might think about that as a sample that isolates the exit and entry decision. And in the full sample, I incorporate that decision. So a difference in the size of coefficients between the first row and the second column would indicate whether there was entry or exit in response to the shocks, right? So you have to look at this graph in 2 ways. You have to check whether the effects decrease once you move columns left to right, which is the case. Effects decay. Most effects are concentrated in first order or in the immediate suppliers in this case, because we're looking at upstream effects. And you can read it comparing the top row with the second row, in which you check whether the coefficient is larger or smaller. In this case, if you compare the first column, the top row and the bottom row, you can see that there was exit in response to the shock, meaning the coefficient in the bottom row is actually larger, in fact, in absolute value, larger or more negative, if I may use the word, in comparison to the restricted sample that just uses the variation that leaves aside entry or exit decisions, right? So I just basically summarize what I just said. Effects on suppliers, we find effects before the trade embargo, because we were hoping, or we were expecting that there were no effects prior to the embargo, but we find effects prior to the embargo out of the trade policies that occurred before the embargo. Heterogeneity matters, as I just mentioned. And what's interesting, and let me get back to this, and if you check the results after the second dash line, you'll see that there is an upward trend and that there is some recovery, but that recovery is partial. Now, where does that recovery come from? I don't have the results here, but that recovery comes from increases in sales of the suppliers of the exporters, which is a smoking gun of domestic substitution. You were getting whatever inputs you were not selling abroad. You were able to sell them at home. So that's the first hypothesis. Now, let's go over the second set of hypotheses. This is about testing what were the differences between the effects of a liquidity shock versus the effect of a demand shock, right? And in particular, I wanted to test this upstream and downstream, because theory tells us that the effects would be different, right? And in particular, in terms of upstream effects, the effects of a foreign trade credit shock, a liquidity shock, would be smaller than those of a demand shock. And this is because of the economics arising of how firms distribute liquidity around the supply chain. And in particular, exporters are large firms, usually with access to the banking system, so they can provide liquidity coverage for their supply chain. In terms of downstream effects, my hypothesis was that the effects of a foreign trade shock would be larger than those of a demand shock. And this is because of what I was mentioning at the beginning. On the liquidity side, demand shocks would alter the scale of production, which would increase prices downstream. And it would also strain the cash flow of firms. Now, as I was mentioning, theory at the time would say that the downstream effects of a demand shock were null out of the cancellation of the substitution and complementarity effects in a Cobb-Douglas setup. So this was about testing whether the setup was capturing or not the reality of supply chains. As I alluded before, the answer was not. Now, to test this, I had to enhance the specification in order to include the multiplicity of shocks. No? I won't get into the details, but basically, instead of testing the direct upstream and downstream indirect exposure to selling to Venezuela, what I was testing is the direct, indirect upstream and downstream exposure of being exposed to the car quota, the liquidity shock, or the demand shock coming from the trade embargo. So in practice, many more coefficients to estimate in this equation. Yes. Yeah, sure.
Quickly ask how you cleanly separate all of these shocks, given they happen kind of right one after the other? Is it not possible that a firm is hit by both simultaneously? I maybe have missed that.
No. That's an excellent question, and this is part of the magic of how the regulation in Venezuela was actually installed, because the regulation was defined at the 10-digit level. So for any given product, you would know at what time was affected by what type of shock. In terms of the timing of the resolutions that were given in March 2008, March 2009, June 2009, and then what products had access in a priority sense or in a conditional sense, or they didn't have access at all to the official US dollars.
Sorry, just last one.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, but what if, just help me out, if you export both cars and something that's on the conditional list, how do you know which, and you see it, you observe, say, a drop in sales, how do you know it's coming from which
in two
change?
ways. No, thank you. In two ways. Empirically speaking, firms concentrate their portfolio in a narrow set of products. So it is unlikely that firms were exposed to multiple shocks. Directly exposed firms were exposed to multiple shocks. Actually, only 1% of exporters were exposed to multiple shocks, or liquidity and demand shocks at once. And also, I went through the regression very quickly, but the magic is also interacting the shocks with time effects. So you know what shock at what time affected the firms of interest. Yeah. Good. So these are the upstream effects for the car quota, which is a demand shock. And what's interesting is that if you remember the prior graph, which was only one shock, selling to Venezuela or not, this is the upstream effects for the car quota, which is the shock that happened in 2008. This is where the variance is coming from. The collapse in sales was about the car quota, right? And the effects were focused on first order effects, immediate suppliers. Second order effects also happened, which were not that present in the prior graph. So we get effects up to third order if you look in the first two periods at third order effects. And in this case, there is no exit at the time. And this makes sense. There were very large firms focused on this chain. Now, demand shock coming from those firms that were exposed to the trade embargo. Most of the significant effects occur. Most of the negative significant effects come after the embargo, there were some positive effects prior to the embargo, which is a bias against my hypothesis, because what I was looking in the data was whether or not after the embargo, the treated firms were actually affected in a negative way. In this case, we do observe exit for the firms exposed to this type of product. And then those firms exposed to the trade credit shock or the liquidity shock from 2008 onwards, I find that effects start happening from the second order onwards. So the effects were not focused on the immediate buyers of these firms, but occurred from the second order afterwards. It gets trickier when you start estimating these coefficients on such a large scales. Nonetheless, this is an interesting finding. Now, I guess I just summarized what I just said. Finally, indirect exporters and resiliency to shocks. The setup allows me to test what happens when you export via a trading company, meaning you export indirectly, or when you export directly, that you have operations established to sell abroad. Now, that is precisely what I test throughout these four hypotheses. The first is the direct effects of a foreign trade shock originating in a regulatory change are larger for direct exporters than for trading companies. Trading companies specialize in a given market. Therefore, specializing precisely in that market would enable you to navigate a given regulatory shock. Second, relative to indirect exporters, the effect on direct exporters of a liquidity shock would be smaller and have less variance. And this is a liquidity coverage. Trading company provide liquidity to indirect exporters. Therefore, they would act as a buffer for the effects. In third place, upstream effects of a foreign trade credit shock are larger for suppliers of indirect exporters relative to those supplying direct exporters. And this is basically out of the nature of firms that are in supply chains that serve indirect exporters vis-a-vis those that are serving indirect exporters. And firms that export indirectly basically are less sophisticated and therefore less able to provide a liquidity buffer for those upstream. And finally, the downstream effects of a foreign trade credit shock are smaller for customers of trading companies relative to those buying from direct exporters. And this stems from the nature of the firms that are interacting here. Trade exporters have an external focus, and they should not be interacting intensively with the domestic economy. So that's kind of a fair summary of the hypothesis I tested. About the specification, this specification becomes even larger because then I don't only have to keep track of the heterogeneity of shocks, but also about the heterogeneity of firms, right? And also, given the nature of the data, I had to keep track of who was indirectly exporting out of being a supplier of a trading company. I wasn't able to separate whether or not, via another administrative record to clearly define whether this firm was using the services of a trading company or not. I just used the network to actually establish whether there was an indirect exporting relationship. Good. So basically, direct exporters do provide liquidity, a liquidity buffer for their suppliers. And I only brought the graph for direct exporters, but basically you see that after the liquidity shock that happened in March 2008, the first dashed line, most of the negative effect is absorbed by direct exporters, and then indirect effects or upstream indirect effects are very small. Then exactly this concerns one of I think is the first and third hypothesis. Then what about the downstream effects for trading companies, which is the other part that I was alluding to, and is that what happens to those quote unquote related or buying from trading companies experience a negative effect after the liquidity shock? And the answer is no, they don't, because they were not, the effect on trading companies, given that they're not specialized in the domestic market, is actually very small. Right? So you were going to ask?
Yeah, can you go back?
Yeah, sure.
Two questions. When you talk about a liquidity shock here,
Mhm.
you talk about a liquidity shock, you're talking about just getting paid, or I'm curious how this works. Is it the trading companies are holding stocks that they can sell out of?
So a liquidity. Thank you for the question. A liquidity shock pertains to the type of access to US dollars you had at a given time. That's and why is that a liquidity shock? Because the idea is to compare what type of access Venezuelan importers had to get US dollars, and therefore how long did it take for them to pay to Colombian exporters. Let's say you imported three things: cars, apples, and oranges, right? Cars, if they had priority access, you would get US dollars at the official exchange rate fairly quickly. You would go, file your request, get your dollars, pay your supplier in Colombia, 90, 120 days. Say oranges had conditional access. So you filed your request, it took a bit longer or not, and the Venezuelan government rationed US dollars as their liquidity crisis from a macroeconomic standpoint got worse. So that request might be at the beginning of 2008, be served in, let's say, 120, 150, sometimes even 90. But then as 2008 progressed and 2009 progressed, that might turn into 150, 180, and so on and so forth. So if you had if a given product had conditional access, it took them progressively longer to get US dollars at the official exchange rate and pay Colombian exporters. And then you have oranges that suppose that they didn't have access to the official exchange rate. Then getting US dollars in Venezuela got progressively complicated. So eventually those firms it took them way longer compared to the other products to pay Colombian exporters. That's what I mean by liquidity. It's working capital timing. If I answer your question.
Yeah, you're just not getting paid.
Exactly.
Right. But wouldn't affect downstream buyers from exporters, right? It would only affect the upstream because they need to get paid too, right?
Depends on the type of exporter. And this is why separating the type. Thank you, Pastor. It depends on the type of exporter, and this is also why testing this hypothesis is interesting from an empirical standpoint. If you're a direct exporter, you might translate your liquidity shock downstream also, because you might start not paying on time your domestic suppliers, which is what has been documented in the liquidity literature as well, right? If you're a trading company, you're not supposed to engage domestically because your business is about specializing selling abroad. That's why documenting that there are effects or there are very small effects or nil effects is interesting from the perspective of those firms that are downstream trading companies. They were not supposed to get effects out of that. If that answers your question. Thank you. So just to wrap up that I have 2 more minutes. When you add up all these effects on what happened in 2008, 2009, and 2010, prior and after the trade embargo, you see that this adds up in terms of like the prediction that this regression enables you to get of around 2 to 2.5 percentage points of GDP. And that effect goes or happens over time. It is not that what the commonplace expectation in Colombia was like they shut down the border. This is where we should have observed a very large, very large negative effect. In fact, people were expecting a recession. And the answer is this was a very large effect, but it was distributed over time, depending on what shock affected what firm overall. So it's actually very interesting that the effect prior to the embargo in 2008 is almost as large as what happened after the embargo, out of what happened with the trade policy after the shocks. So allow me to wrap up on some future research avenues and ideas for the OECD. I dashed through this presentation, and if you believe me, there are many remaining points that remain unanswered, and the literature is, and academia is working on that as we speak. The first is, this is about documenting diffusion on a fixed network. It's okay. In fact, I fixed the network prior to shocks. You might think about that in an instrumental variable sense. The 2007 network is very similar to the 2008 network. So it has an instrumental variable sense. But the shock could have changed the structure of the Colombian economy. And in fact, anecdotal evidence shows that that's the case. Many of the manufacturing capacity that was devoted to Venezuela actually went to the oil and mining industry. Second, this is a problem of establishing causal effects in a network. And this is, I tackled this problem from a particular vantage point. Can we see or can we find alternative ways to calculate or to estimate these indirect effects? And in particular, taking into account something, which takes me back to the data point, and is that the network I was able to assemble is incomplete, right? Out of misreporting, out of the fact that there are cutoffs, that might be affecting the results. Third, which is very important from a policy standpoint right now, and is that, was the Venezuelan market replaced with other destinations? This was about 2014 question. Now that the relationships, the diplomatic and trade relationships have been established, and where bridges or relationships that date prior to the embargo were able to be reestablished. That's a very important question. And finally, we're looking at a single cut of the economy, which is what's the value flowing between firms. But the economy is a multigraph. You have many flows. You have financial flows, you have value flows, you have property networks. What is the relationship between the financial network and the production network and the ownership network? And finally, as my grain of salt for the agenda that the OECD and Andrea and his team are pushing is, I would say, fourfold. And is within this framework that the OECD has proposed, as I mentioned in my introduction, I would say data processing is non-trivial. And in a cross-country setup, which would be the greatest value that the OECD, in my humble opinion, could add to this literature, is neither. This should be considered an integral part of the process. And I would suggest a common code base, or even thinking about a common data platform that we can actually put together all these data sets in a productive sense. The second is to bridge network science and economics. This is where I come from. And I guess the message here is not using network science just for the sake of using it, as everyone is talking about AI just because they want to do AI. There's a FOMO out of this. We just need to think what part of the network science literature enables us to answer an economically powerful questions. It's what topological or what characterization makes sense to answer an economically productive thing. The third point, which I mentioned, is computational tools matter. I'm delighted that James is connected from New Zealand. We work very hard to build the C++ library to analyze millions, hundreds of millions networks, nodes and links networks, so you can actually analyze them in a reasonable server. And finally, in terms of the opportunities, I think you will find a lot of demand for insights in the tax space. Network and economic analysis of VAT transaction data is very precious for tax administrations. There is a literature on ghost firms, for instance. Firms are, value chains that go nowhere. That kind of stuff. That you can find those golden nuggets when you analyze this data at scale. And finally, as I was discussing with Andrew this morning, this is the first step in the agenda. What would happen if you were to increase the frequency? Just checking invoice data, not yearly data. And what happens when you increase the granularity of transaction analysis? That will take you to inflation. That will take you to the types of goods that you are investing, which I think the OECD is uniquely qualified to contribute to the world. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, David. That was wonderful. We have quite a few questions online, I see, and I think there are probably some questions in the room. But before we do that, we are going to give the floor to our discussant, Andrea Linarello. Andrea is an economist and deputy head of the Firms and Regional Analysis Division in the Structural Economic Analysis Directorate at the Bank of Italy. His research interests are in international trade, productivity, and macroeconomics. He's also been recently working with firm-to-firm transaction data and is participating in the LIFT network. He holds a PhD in economics from the Universitat de Pompeu Fabra. Andrea, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Okay, can you share the slides? So, perfect. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to discuss the paper. The presentation was great. Let me use the usual disclaimer. So the opinion expresses are personal and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Bank of Italy. Next slide, please. Okay, so the presentation was sufficiently clear. So here is just a quick summary of the paper, of my understanding of the slides. So basically, the paper built a firm-to-firm network for Colombia, combining multiple data sets and data sources, and used the Venezuelan trade policy change to study direct and indirect effect of the shock, of this trade policy shock. It also tried to estimate the effect of different types of shocks, which are labeled in the paper as liquidity and demand shocks. And one of the avenue that it explored to build the results of the paper to exploit heterogeneity both in terms of the exposure to the shocks and in terms of the characteristics of the firms, in particular the exporters, whether they export directly or indirectly with trade intermediaries. The main finding of the paper, I would say, is that, heterogeneity in exposure matter because, as David showed throughout his presentation, basically the effect change depending whether firms are directly or indirectly exposed. It seems that demand shocks are a bit more important than liquidity shocks, as far I understood from the slides. And also that, there was this partial recovery after the shock because part of the Colombian firms switched to the domestic markets to recover from the Venezuelan trade policy shock. So next slide, please. Okay, I will focus my discussion on three main points without entering too much into the detail of the paper. These are a mix of technical and economic questions, but I think they are all relevant for drawing policy insights from these types of works, and in particular within the context of the OECD and the LIFT network. So the first point I would like to make is how to estimate regressions when the SUTVA might be violated. And this is a common problem we have to face when we work with firm-to-firm data. The second point is more about how to interpret the dichotomy of shocks that has been proposed by David in terms of liquidity versus demand. And finally, I think it's important to nowadays there are several papers that study the propagation of shocks in production networks, and to draw insights for policy design. I think that it's important to try to benchmark the results with the existing studies. But let me touch upon one of each this point. Next slide, please. So how to estimate regression when the SUTVA might be violated? So the problem is, I think, clear to everybody in the room. So in presence of firm-to-firm production actor, the SUTVA assumption might be violated, even if the shock is plausible exogenous. In terms of these 2 points, the exogeneity of the shock and the SUTVA, first about the exogeneity. I mean, it's true that the trade policy shock used in the paper is plausibly exogenous, but this is true only if the Venezuelan government decided to move some product in one list rather than the other for reasons that are completely exogenous to the characteristics of the sectors or the product, in particular in the Colombian economy. So I think that there is a need to show that the way products are selected in one list or the other is not dependent of the characteristics of the product per se. For example, the Venezuelan government could have targeted the sectors or products that were particularly high productivity growth in Colombia, particular innovatives, and this might explain why products are moved in one list or the other. So basically, there is a need to show that the characteristic of those goods cannot predict the change in the trade policy. So even if this was a decision made by another government, it's important to tackle the point about exogeneity. And then there is the SUTVA assumption. So the idea that the treatment of one unit does not affect other units. Of course, this is not true by definition in production network and when we work with firm-to-firm data. And also there is a need to balance the computation feasibility. For example, you put the cutoff at distance 3 with making the SUTVA assumption the more reasonable. I understand from the presentation that you show a graph about the decay of exposure for larger cutoff. It was not clear to me when I first read the slide, but I think this is very important, not only in the context of your study, but in the context of the several papers that we aim to write in the near future, exploiting, for example, the lift network. It's not obvious at all how to define treated and control units. For example, you talk about a lot about the export to Venezuela, but for example, Colombian firms might have been also importing goods from Venezuela, and this could have second round effects. So try to clearly identify a control group within the context of firm-to-firm sector. It's not obvious. I think you did a great job, but also I think that perhaps within the lift network, we can start talking about also this methodological issue and try to build a set of robustness checks that, make us confidence to build the right comparison group. Next slide, please. Okay, second point is about different types of shock. I apologize, but I was not fully convinced about your definition of liquidity versus demand shock. But I find the idea of studying different types of shocks super interesting. But let me explain why I was not fully convinced, but perhaps I misunderstood what I read in the slide. So I interpret demand shocks has shifts in the demand curve faced by firms. And I think that we agree on that. For example, when you talk about the car quota, this was clear because you say, look, car quota, by definition, reduce the amount of cars that Colombian firms could sell to Venezuela. Fine, shift in the demand curve. About the liquidity shocks, I was not completely sure because when I think about liquidity shocks, and perhaps here, making clear statement about definition of what a liquidity shock is important because liquidity shocks to me are sudden unavailability of liquid funds to firms. And when we talk about liquidity shocks, we have in mind credit crunch, sudden change in collateral values that make firms less likely to access external source of finance, or also sudden drop in revenues. Now, what I understand about the conditional, the access to conditional list of products generated by the change in the Venezuelan trade policy is the following. Now, suppose there are two firms that agree on a contract which has like product specification, delivery of the physical goods, and payment conditions. So basically, to classify the access to conditional list as a liquidity shocks, you are assuming that the contract is signed, that the good is produced and delivered, and the Venezuelan firms do not respect the payment condition because ex post, the Venezuelan firms cannot access the dollar at the preferential rate. So the Colombian firm experienced basically a drop in revenue, or maybe it's better to say that it experienced a payment delay. I think this is what you have in mind when you talk about the liquidity shocks. Contracts that are signed and around the change of the policy, unavailability of liquidity. But what comes to my mind is that, I mean, the change in the trade regime for a particular product might also generate other types of stuff, other types of effects. First of all, Colombian firms might decide, because I mean Venezuela is not might be not considered a safe trade partner, might only decide to sign contracts with a cash in advance clause. So before they receive the payment, after they produce and deliver the goods. And so this would be not like a liquidity shock. Or also because firms anticipate the fact that there could be payment delays, they decide not to sign the contract at all ex ante, because they anticipate that ex post there might be problem with the payment. And this is not a liquidity shock, but indeed a demand shock, no? Because there were goods that before had access to a market, but then there is a shift, if you think about it in the terms of the demand curve, because I mean less goods are exported. So I think it's not clear whether what you label as a liquidity shock is indeed a liquidity shock. But I think that one way out is to show like first order effect on outcomes that speaks to liquidity, to convince that this is indeed a good way to classify different types of change in trade regimes into shocks. Next slide, please. So finally, I think this is, I mean, it's not a comment specific to your presentation. I think it's a comment which applies to several work. The idea that now we have availability of several studies that documented the propagation of shocks in production network. And when I read this paper, I always find, okay, what I can learn for example, for policy design or policy making. I think that there is a need to benchmark the results across countries and across studies. Possibly, perhaps using similar empirical specification and compare quantitatively the results, because I mean the policy need is to understand whether results in one particular context differ from another. For example, because country differ in several respects, or because the shocks are different, the firms and the network characteristics are different. I mean, to take all this evidence together to derive insight. But to do that, it's necessary to benchmark in the results. For example, in a quantitative sense, I don't know whether this trade regime in Colombia generate an effect which was larger or smaller compared to the same shock that perhaps have been studied in other countries. And finally, I think that heterogeneity is crucial, but it is important to use fundamentals like firm characteristics or observable characteristics that can be used for policy design. In your exercise, for example, intermediaries versus direct exporter is clear. Sometimes this is less clear, not in your setting, but perhaps in the paper that we observe in other contexts. Next slide, please. So the conclusion is, I mean, overall, I think this is a great paper and a great research agenda. You have great data, you have a clear policy experiment. I mean, you work a lot of the empirical specification and approach, even if I try to give you suggestions perhaps to make it even more sound. But of course, I mean, with the increasing availability of this empirical study, I think that's something we have to think about and perhaps discuss within the network also, is to tackle better like methodological issues and find perhaps a common way to benchmarking the results to generate like policy relevant insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. We can open the floor to questions now. And I know there's some, maybe we'll kick it off with the online question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we have you.
Yeah, okay. Hi David, thank you very much. Great presentation, super relevant to the things that we're doing with Lyft. If I can ask two questions. I was wondering if I understand your results correctly, in the foreign trade shock, you find that the impact is larger for first degree suppliers, but not so much for sort of the firms that are directly exposed to the shock. And I was wondering, touching a little bit on what Andrea said about elements of heterogeneity, if this could be because firms that trade, exporters or importers, are normally much larger firms than the average firm. And when there's negative assortativity networks, so large firms connect with smaller firms, basically the first degree suppliers are much smaller firms with much less sort of scope for adjustment to the shock than the directly affected firms who are the traders. And then a second question, a bit on the methodology, which you may have looked at or not, but if you had, it would be great to have your thoughts. I was wondering whether you considered, while sort of setting up your specification, borrowing from the spatial spillovers literature, sort of the text model that says my outcomes are a function of sort of the interactions, or the spatial spillover literature, the weights matrix is the people that you share borders with. Of my neighbors, are common characteristics, my own characteristics, and then sort of common shocks. And then if this is something that you considered in your research, whether you could maybe comment on why you preferred your current approach. This is something that I have been wondering, sort of reading production networks papers and then sort of econometrics of networks papers. And I was wondering if it's something that you came across, and if yes, if you had any thoughts. Thank you.
Maybe given Christina's questions sort of similar to the points that Andrea raised, maybe you want to respond now and then we'll take questions, or you want to take them all?
Let's take Andrea's and
Okay.
So Andrea, Christina, thank you for your questions, and Andrea, thank you for your detailed comments. I think they're extremely valuable. The SADVA part is part of the Christina's point. It's in this context, this is a panel regression in a network. It requires a lot of identification assumptions to be met. Given the empirical setup, most of the common conundrums one faces were taken care of. The main point of whether the shocks or the changes in the list were targeted to particular sectors directed or were related to Colombian firms in the economy, mostly coming from qualitative research. And this is something, given the time we have, I didn't mention. But part of this research project was actually undertaking conversations with entrepreneurs, government officials, both in Colombia and Venezuela, to understand what actually happened. And basically, the rationale for deciding what product got in or out of the list was bureaucratic and driven by Venezuelan interest, not related to Colombian characteristics, Colombian firms, or Colombian products. So, and the rationale to deciding what products were put or not in a given list, depending on the rationing of dollars that the Venezuelans needed to do at a given time. So that, at least from a qualitative standpoint, gave me enough ease to think that it was clear enough to claim that the SADVA assumption could be attainable. Also, this also brings me back to the regression design and to the treatment control setup that I propose. There are many ways to do this. And what I tried to do was to control for as much as possible, given the information I had, which explains why the regression is so complicated. Because to make the Sattva assumption tenable, what I decided to do is to control for all the indirect effects that could be coming from the shocks that I am interested in, which are the coefficients I report, but also from other shocks that were happening in the network, which are the coefficients I don't report. In fact, I don't estimate them directly, but I control for them indirectly to avoid the computational burden. So that at least there are other identification matters that I happily addressed in the paper. I'll be happy to discuss them. That also connects with the question on spatial econometrics. That's a very interesting point. I actually started getting interested in this topic in studying urban and regional economics and studied spatial econometrics. It gets really hard when you estimate a spatial autoregressive model in a network, given the size of the matrix that you have to estimate. Super hard. You know, we're talking about 100,000 by 100,000 matrix in this context. Gets larger, the larger the economy gets. So at least for the production network setup, I wouldn't go that route. There are two other routes. One of them is the one I propose, in which basically you try to reasonably define a treatment and control group exploiting the topology of the network, and you cut off and say this is, you know, you say the cutoff is 3, and then you define a treated group as the control group as the other group, as Vasco Carvalho did. And the other comes from the statistical causal inference literature, in which instead of aiming to estimate first, second, third, or more effects, if your data allows you to do, is to define units of observations to estimate, let's say, the indirect effect. But instead of defining the unit of observation as a firm, you start defining the entire cluster of a given firm. I'll be happy to point you to the reference for that. Now, what else Andrea said, I think it's important to address. Demand versus liquidity shocks. That's what your points were extremely clever. And once again, I defer to my qualitative research, and I give you some points in the data. The first is that exports prior to the embargo kept growing. So the case for a demand shock is very weak in the presence of this liquidity crisis. In fact, the largest export number from Venezuela to Colombia was at the end of 2008. So demand was actually growing. And the promise of being paid eventually for Colombian firms was good enough that they kept selling. The margins were too big to ignore that market at that point. So contracts were indeed signed, and they were honored from the Colombian counterparts. And there is also anecdotal evidence of Colombian officials actually going to Venezuela and helping entrepreneurs to helping them get paid because they kept selling and selling and selling and selling and selling. So the demand, at least for the information I have from qualitative and indirect data evidence, it is not the case. What I should have pointed before is that this liquidity shock is not as sudden as you discussed, and I clearly understand where you're coming from. This was a more, I would say, unraveling, slowly growing crisis as the US dollars became more and more and more scarce in Venezuela. That's why the interactions with time effects are crucial to understand when the effects happen and how severe they became over time. That's it. I think I got that, Andrea's main points, and I think I got Christina's main points. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Mr. Ambassador?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, excellent paper. I also enjoyed it a lot, but let me hammer away a little bit more on Andrea's point. I think that he's getting at one of these philosophical discussions in economics of the difference between liquidity and solvency, or solvency and so on, which is why maybe you don't need to turn it into such a dichotomous thing, or if it's a demand shock or a liquidity shock. Because, I mean, as you're saying, of course, this is a demand shock, only that, I mean, of course, the clients stop buying, but that doesn't mean that you shut down. I guess that what I'm trying to get at is that different firms have different ability of turning a temporary stop in orders into something that they can write off because they are so diversified and they have access to different pockets of money, or those that are that, okay, yeah, we really have to eat all this shock right away, okay? And for them, it really feels like a demand shock. And you have information about heterogeneity, so maybe you can all, I'm not saying to turn it into a continuous variable or anything like that, but at least to nuance a little bit the definition of what is liquidity based on the characteristics of the firm that is exposed, okay? And second is just an afterthought, but I still haven't figured out how this would affect your results. But still piggybacking on Andrea's question about the exogeneity of the changes in Caribe. I mean, at the risk of not being a very good diplomat, but if I recall correctly, back then everybody was complaining that Caribe was rife with opportunities for, advantageous purchases and sell of dollars and so on. So I'm wondering if maybe some of the demand of the transactions you were that were showing up in your data were actually just milling dollars around from one exchange rate to the other. I don't know. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you for your questions. I'll start with the second one. That is indeed something that happened that I cannot control for. That's a sad part of the history of the Colombian and Venezuela trade relationship. Well, I can give you a sense of what people who were in the field happened, and just to explain a little bit more the ambassador's point, given that I'm not a diplomat, there were fake exports from Colombia to Venezuela. Because it was very lucrative to do that. Because you can send an empty container, go to Caribe, buy dollars at the official exchange rate, and then go to the black market or rate market and sell them at the market rate. So people got rich doing that, not only by fake exports, but also by and several lines of business, if you're going to call it that way. What I can tell you is that two things. One anecdotal and one data cleaning standpoint, and is that in the data cleaning process, I got rid of all exporters that had no VAT declarations. There were some exporters that did not declare VAT. I got rid of exporters that didn't have a buyer or a supplier, which basically are exporters that are selling to Venezuela without having a supply chain. What a coincidence. And other, steps in the data cleaning process that enabled me, at least, to put it in a philosophical way, to not to put me in a position of not being able to reject the null hypothesis that these people are not cheating on their taxes. That's as good as it gets. Now, regarding the sizing of this, I spoke with people who were working in ProColombia back then, ProExport at that point, and they claimed that around the $6 billion of exports going to Colombia to Venezuela, around 1 billion were fake. So that's what we're talking about. And that is why I go back to my point of analyzing this data at scale is a huge opportunity for tax and customs authorities to try to actually discover that type of scheme. And I guess that's it.
I think, unfortunately, we are out of time. We have a hard stop here now, basically, to allow people to get lunch. David, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Andrea, many thanks for the comments and for all the discussion.
Yeah, they were great.
I think this really shows how important these policy areas are and how important transaction data is to making progress on them. So thank you again. Thank you to everyone for your participation. If you are interested in the LIFT network, please do not hesitate to get in touch. And we will see you all at our next PIE seminar on October 14th with Professor Juan Fernandez de Guevara, who will be here talking about productivity in Spain. Thank you, everyone.